Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Williamson, Dean of the College of Architecture at Texas Tech, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this semester's quite impressive symposium, Health, Architectural and Historical Contexts. So I'd like to welcome all of our guests and all, members of the audience, and I think I'll begin to kick off the conference right now. Architecture has been intertwined with history from its inception as both a discipline and a profession. The relationship that architecture enjoys with history has been extraordinarily productive, as architects sought and continue to seek both a formal and social basis for their work. History provides a body of knowledge and often a set of precedents. It tells the story of the reception of architectural works, and it describes how life unfolds in and around architecture. As in any field, history evolves, and as history evolves, we as architects are challenged to think about the ways that we might broaden our engagement with that history and its scholarship. The subject of today's symposium is health. And in 2021, I cannot think of a more important subject. We cannot look at health without seeing society's most pressing challenges, including inequality, climate crisis, systemic racism, and other multiple forms of discrimination. And that's not to mention the present pandemic that we are involved in. Today's symposium attempts to unpack the historical and architectural context for some of these issues. The three themes of today's symposium are embodiments, engineered places, and technologies of representation. The talks on these themes highlight personhood as they relate health to identity, space, and forms of inquiry. Each of the themes will be addressed separately by both an architect and a historian. Addressing the same theme from two related but independent disciplines broadens the kinds of information that we can assess. It highlights how different modes of inquiry lead to different ideas about what is interesting, important, and useful. One hopes that it also leads to a mutual opening up of perspectives across disciplines as well. I would like to introduce today's speakers. The first theme, embodiments, will be addressed by Doctors David Gibson and Dale Kretz. David Gibson is professor of history and professor of architecture and history at the New School and Parsons School of Design. A prolific author and theorist, David works at the intersection of architecture, history, and speculative design. Dale Kretz is assistant professor of history at Texas Tech. Dale teaches on African-American history and the history of race and medicine. Dale's forthcoming book is titled Administering Freedom, the State of Emancipation After the Freedmen's Bureau. The second theme, engineered places, will be addressed by Doctors Julie Zook and Lucia Carminati. Julie is an assistant professor at Texas Tech with a focus on design and health. She is co-chair of the symposium, and her forthcoming book, an edited volume, is titled The Covert Life of Hospital Architecture. Lucia is an assistant professor of history at Texas Tech, who works on social and cultural histories of the Middle East. Lucia is currently working on the manuscript Seeking Bread and Fortune in Port Said, 1859 to 1906, Labor, Mobility, and the Making of the Suez Canal. The third and final theme, Technologies of Representation, is addressed by Doctors David Theodore and Jennifer Wallace. David is the Canada Research Chair in Architecture, Health, and Computation at the School of Architecture at McGill University. David's work spans research scholarship, criticism, and journalism on technology and healthcare architecture, among other issues. Jennifer is a lecturer in history of science and medicine and a medical humanities teaching fellow at the Imperial College London. Her publications include Investigating the Body in the Victorian Asylum and the co-authored volume, Anxious Times, Medicine and Modernity in 19th Century Britain. Dr. Jacob Baum Associate Professor of History at Texas Tech, is co-chair with Julie Zook of today's symposium. He will be moderating discussion after the talks on each theme. Finally, I want to thank all of the speakers and co-chairs in advance for their work. This has been a labor of both devotion and love, but it also addresses an extraordinarily important theme. So welcome everyone. Thank you for participating. One final word. The College of Architects is pleased to sponsor this symposium. It is in line with our mission, which emphasizes creativity and innovation in scholarship, and it supports our core values of respect, accountability, curiosity, and excellence. I hope that today's symposium becomes a part of a larger conversation on health between the humanities and architecture. Architecture cannot fully meet its obligations to individuals and society without a deep and comprehensive understanding of context, and history is indispensable to this understanding. So again, we welcome those of you who are visiting our college, those from other institutions and other places. Thank you for joining us today. And now I will turn the dais, I guess, the virtual dais over to our first speaker, David Gibson. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate that introduction. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. And thanks, Julie, also for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. And I realize listening to your introduction, the topic of health is something I've really thought about almost my entire adult life. So I really enjoy the discussions that we'll have today. So the talk hang on. Can you see my screen when I press play? Hang on. Oh, hang on. I have to hit share screen. Sorry. Okay, here we go. That's working, correct? Yeah, okay, great. So I want to talk to you today about some work from a forthcoming book of mine on the topic of disability and architecture, and that it may not relate directly to the subject of health per se, but certainly brings in a perspective that might be useful to the discussions and ideas that we'll discuss today. So the book that I'm developing is called The Architecture of Disability, and it's a historical and theoretical examination of how human impairment, broadly conceived, might be rethought within the discipline of architecture. And just to convey in maybe a somewhat odd way the connection I have to this topic, that's actually is very personal. That's a photograph on the right that was taken in collaboration with my colleague Philippe Ram of me, and it reveals that I'm missing the entirety of my left leg immediately below the hip through layers of cosmetics and clothes and other things. So this is something that I've been thinking about for quite a bit of time, realizing its connection to a lot of my work, but also trying to find a way to discuss it that's very different than recent topics on, than the way this topic has been explored in the past in ways that I'll explain. So chiefly, I question the way the politics of access and accessibility has dominated the discussion of disability, architecture, cities, and landscape. I find the topic of access, above all, in discussions of disability in space, often elides a much deeper and more critical spatial politics that disabled people might stage. On the one hand, I think the almost exclusive focus on access in architectural engagements with disability aligns the problems of human impairment with ideas about the human body drawn from functionalist and mechanistic philosophies. And this is extraordinarily ironic, as mechanistic and functionalist ideas were actually used to invent the notion of disability in the first place. So additionally, and maybe more importantly, a focus on access often forecloses the way disabled people might create alliances and rethinking spaces and through any number of political registers. So for example, I lived in California for a long time and during most of my career. And I personally have difficulty aligning myself with disabled colleagues who demand access to United States wilderness areas or who seek improvements in wilderness access. You know, by contrast, I think those of us who identify as disabled and in need of rethinking of space should align our own interests as impaired people with others who imagine alternative forms of conservation and alternative nature aesthetics, and one that doesn't valorize like biological vitalism, and or we can connect ourselves with people demanding land restitution in this country. So something very different than just a flat out politics of access. And another example, and that I'll talk about more today, and I think was the reason I was invited today, is how the discourse on what's called accessible heritage, the accessibility of historic spaces, forecloses the way human impairment might be used to reconsider what history is at a material level. So if we're going to talk about health and history, like how do impaired people rethink what the historic is at a very basic and material level? And this is a really good segue into really beginning the substance of my talk. Okay, so on the preservation of disability. So accessible heritage is pretty much what it sounds like. It describes efforts that enable disabled people to experience historic sites and urban areas more easily. Here you see a ramped addition to the archaeological park at Pompeii. And here's another example of accessible heritage, a kind of fantastic image. This is an elevator that was built on the north face of the Acropolis in Athens, Greece in 2004, a site that's over 2,500 years old. And it enables people with mobility disabilities to ascend to the top. And so you're going to see a lot of this site today because I'm currently working on a project with a Greek archaeologist named Mantha Zarmakoupi and a classical art historian named Jennifer Steger that's engaged with the site and actually doing a very modest project at this site. So the whole idea of accessible heritage is built around a liberal principle of balance in which one negotiates the presumed historic authenticity of the past or a site with the needs of disabled people who either want to experience it as tourists or, in the case of like a much older city, live among such sites, as in like a historic area like Greenwich Village in New York or the center of Cairo, for example, among many, many other examples, of course. So the idea of balance means that when we address disability in a historical site, we would engage in two projects side by side. Okay, so one involves the work of archaeologists and restorers who reconstruct and or preserve elements, kind of reviving history out of the rubble heaps of history. And on the other side are those kinds of technicians or experts in impairment and disability in space, and who consult with the archaeologists and historians, and who figure out how people might more easily visit these spaces through their work. And their goal is to not interfere with the integrity or authenticity with history itself. Here we're back at the north face where the elevator to the Acropolis was actually recently renovated and rebuilt. So at the Acropolis itself, this idea of balance continues to inform access strategies there. So this is a very recent image, just taken just in the last couple of months, where we see the Acropolis entering a third or fourth stage of reconstruction. In the back, you see some scaffolding on the Acropolis. And in the middle ground, you can see construction crews installing a new set of concrete pavers on the site. And this provides a kind of more durable and navigable circulation route for people who visit it. And this is really the first fully wheelchair accessible route that's been built here. And of course, if you have vision impairments, this makes things easier for you too. Here's a diagram of the routes and other access features being completed on the sites. So all this is fine. I don't want to dismiss, these efforts, okay? They're certainly not without their controversies. For example, some archaeologists, particularly archaeologists who work on ancient Greece, believe that access to this site should be curtailed because increasing access will inevitably damage the monuments here. So as we increase access for disabled people, we also make it easier for throngs of people to visit these sites and potentially damage them just through the sheer numbers. So thus, one might embrace a lack of access as a virtue in the pursuit of historic preservation. And this brings us back to the problem of balance, of course. I have a different critique. I believe the values of accessible heritage are one of the many ways that impairment is foreclosed from offering any kind of critical perspective on the whole idea of authenticity that historians and archaeologists seek. So for example, the history of disability and impairment at this or countless other sites is extensive and difficult to integrate into a kind of touristic focus on monumentality and the vitality of the past. So as almost all of your architects and architecture students know, the Acropolis was a religious pilgrimage site in ancient times. And one of its roles was as a space in which people came to reflect on their impairments. These are votive offerings found at the shrine of Asclepius at the site. The right is from actually from a different site, but shows a man carrying a votive of his leg, which was probably impaired in some way. The statuary and architectural ornamentations of this site and that are revered include references to impairment that are direct and indirect. For example, on the left is the representation of the Greek god Hephaestus from the Parthenon's frieze, and he's actually shown with a crutch underneath his arm. He had a disfigured, this is one of the gods who had a disfigured foot and walked with a limp. The right panel is one of many countless that have survived or have been lost, and that depict forms of bodily violence that abound throughout the site. Finally, and relative to the whole question of access and mobility, the site itself presents fragments of ancient access routes, including trace evidence of an enormous ramp that actually connected the top of the Acropolis to the agora below, and it's 2,000 years old. This is a photograph of one of the people I'm working with, the Greek archaeologist Manthos Armakupi, and that shows fragments of the enormous ramp that once led to the front of the Acropolis and that disappeared long ago and was part of its original design. The image on the right is by the archaeologist Deborah Sneed, who works on disability in ancient Greece, and it shows a ramp fronting the temple at Epheia. Many Greek monuments did not have steps, or had steps, but also had ramps as well, something that's little known. So what I'd like to suggest, just to enter into this and begin to enter into this more deeply, is that disability is not a problem to be solved, particularly relative to the experience of history. But disability and impairment are forms of interpretation that have not been adequately unleashed in our interpretation, reimagining the past. So thus, I kind of want to invert the meaning of images like this, and that are meant to show like charitable access strategies to blind people to help them understand the past. I know this is not true, but I want to imagine that these blind people are actually telling those people who are not blind they are in fact explaining history and historic meaning through their experiences and the recovery of histories that they find relevant to them. So to that end, I think once we extend past the concept of accessible heritage and this kind of facile idea of balance, we can also understand heritage itself as a space of impairment. In other words, history is, I believe, as a material experience, is imagined as that which partially has a very integral relationship to disabling or impairment concepts. Let me just explain this complex idea just a little bit more. And in thinking about this, I think we can confront many embedded aesthetic ideas about historical experience, and that actually relate to all of our practices of history, which contain a kind of intense athleticism that moves through all of them. So here, I want to address how, I want to acknowledge how inaccessible many historic sites and urban cores are. This and extends from actual sites to even the archive, so to speak. So when someone, when someone tells me that they want to see a historic building or historic area of a city, I know firsthand how extraordinarily challenging such places are to disabled people. But I don't think it's an inherent condition of age. It's not a condition of things being historic. I argue that the inaccessibility of the past is an aesthetic aspect of historical experience itself. So it's a quality that is artificially built into sites. And it's one of the key aesthetic features of what makes something historic in the first place, and as we define that term. So the previous image and these here depict the architecture of the current path to the Acropolis. This was designed by the architect Dimitri Pikionis and realized in 1957. And it's regarded as a major contribution to mid-century landscape design and archaeological design as well. So you walk along this intensely tactile and steep path of broken marble that winds its way through the site. And in contrast to the enormous ancient ramp in which once enabled people to ascend collectively, this path becomes increasingly narrow as it rises through the site. And its aesthetics emphasize individual experience and a kind of athletic exertion involved in the experience of history generally, and the experience of this site more specifically. And all of this makes the aesthetics of the reconstructed Acropolis appear to be a result of time and the effects of nature versus politics and historical choices and often violent episodes. And none of this, of course, is unique to the Acropolis. This mix of athleticism, individualism, romanticism, and naturalism are really the kind of global aesthetics of historical and archaeological knowledge and experience. This is the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, in which I visited a few years ago, and I felt had a very similar kind of sentiment. And this is my Son Acham site in Vietnam. This is actually an extraordinary site. You can see bomb craters from the American War in Vietnam, but all of this is folded into a kind of discourse on time and history versus violence and artificiality. Okay, so let me bring this to the last section, and I have no idea how I'm doing on time. I have a good 10 minutes left, is that okay? Okay, great, okay. So let me talk about this idea of the preservation of disability. So I want to think of ways out of these aesthetics and the whole idea of balance that I discussed earlier. So what I want to call the preservation of disability is meant to describe several interrelated things. The recovery of histories of impairment and that are part of all monuments. I've talked about that a little bit. The preservation of actual moments of disfigurement and violence and that are also part of, I think, all monumental histories. And also a form of preservation or reconstruction, and that emerges from the perspectives and languages of disabled people. So in developing this concept, I have to draw on many other people. So to preserve some of the disfigured quality of monuments may sound strange, but it's actually central to the idea of quote unquote disability aesthetics and conceptualized by the late scholar Tobin Siebers. So in his book, Disability Aesthetics, which you see on the left, Siebers argued that vandalized and damaged artworks, particularly anthropological ones, disturb us because they often resemble disabled bodies. And he was particularly interested in how we might reflect on damaged anthropomorphic works of art and as ways to consider the cultural position of disability. So he's sort of like an anti-restorationist in some way. He was also interested in aesthetic practices of reconstruction that would preserve the disfigured appearance of damaged works. So this isn't in his book, but it illustrates his concept very well. And the type of, it involves this restorationist aesthetics around a Renaissance statue that was broken apart, in which they actually used a variety of techniques from casting and resetting people's legs to rebuild this statue. And it sort of really blurs, or it doesn't sort of, it does blur relationships between the disfigurement of people and artifacts. So Siebers considered acts of vandalism that happened over time, or maybe were related to particular moments of iconoclasm. But his ideas can be entangled with others who also considered the changing meaning of artifacts damaged due to more political events like wars and civil violence. So these are images from the exhibition The Keeper at the New Museum in New York City, and that explored collecting as a form of vanguard culture. And what you're looking at here are ancient Roman bronzes and glassworks that are held in the collections of the National Museum in Beirut, and that were damaged in the shelling of those collections during the Civil War of the 1980s. And the conservator in charge of these works, Maurice Chabab, argued that these works should remain in their damaged condition as a type of testament to the war, something that blurs a kind of forensic and disability aesthetics. So rather than being restored, they operate as works of history twice over, representatives of ancient Rome and representations of the shelling of the museum. And in a similar way, the Berlin-based curator Julian Chapuis has also brought a lot of wartime damaged artifacts out of archives in Berlin museums as a type of evidentiary aesthetics, and that also entangles with disability aesthetics. So many of the works in his and other museums that became badly damaged during World War II were considered too emotionally intense to display because the figurative works bore injuries that resembled those of wounded war veterans or people that survived the war. And just like Siebers, these works, as they became displayed, became blurry connections between the aesthetics of conservation and disability. So there's another way to consider the preservation of disability. It's a bit different, and that involves how impaired people might create records and documents about their aesthetic experiences. So this is an image of Georgina Klieg, a blind writer who's become quite a significant mentor of mine. and who frequently explores her own experiences of artworks as a blind person. So her engagements with sculptures, primarily through touch, or the way she navigates sculptures with her cane by tapping them, become another type. She uses this as a type of description that she gives or develops in collaborations with museum conservators in their understandings of collection. So rather than just a photograph of the work, you have Georgina's record of what it feels like in a way that maybe a conservator doesn't feel entirely comfortable talking about, or doesn't have the language to talk about, because it's not the way they primarily experience historical artifacts. There's an image of her shorelining that describes when a blind person or someone who's visually impaired uses a cane, taps their cane along a surface or a profile, in which she's shorelining a large Richard Serra sculpture. This actually entered into the conservators' report so they could understand the tactility of the metal as it's installed. So really interesting, I think actually rather extraordinary work. So another aspect of Georgina's research and that interests me involves her efforts to create more sophisticated interpretive tools in public arts education. So these are raised tactile depictions of architecture from the past, and that were used 100 years ago in educating blind people in art history. These kinds of things are still made today. These are text descriptions, and they're also used as interpretive tools for blind people. Text description is basically what it sounds like, involves having someone describe a work so that it can be visualized by someone who cannot see. And one of the interesting things about text interpretation is that it provides much more information than the photograph. It's moving around the object in a way that a photograph, a still photograph, of course, cannot. So in some ways, it's a more sophisticated form of representation from a spatial aspect. So for me, the preservation of disability might involve bringing these forms of representation to bear on the actual reconstruction of monuments. I know that sounds strange. So essentially reversing some of the ways we understand them and their role. So rather than access tools that enable quote unquote able-bodied people to accommodate disabled people, we imagine how disabled forms of languages and forms of understanding in the past become inserted or used to reconstruct or reimagine original works. So if this sounds strange, to use text or tactile representations to reconstruct or maintain artifacts, we already do this, and to varying degrees. For example, one of the most famous buildings in antiquity, shown here, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, is known only through written descriptions of it, and it's been reconstructed numerous times and based on written language descriptions. Tactile and contour representations of work, which remove color to reveal only the topographies of surfaces, are emerging as critical conservation tools. So this is what's called a reflectance transformation image of a funerary artwork, and that's undergoing restoration, and in which maintaining the contours of the paints, the texture, the topography, is central to maintaining this work's quote unquote authenticity and above and beyond the actual visual quality of the image. So the preservation of disability might involve text and contour, like rivaling the opticality of photographs or the visuality, let's say, of or opticality of a monument as conservation tools and representative works. So finally and ultimately, the preservation of disability suggests that disabled people themselves will be able to draw on their experiences, their language, their incapacities, maybe their traumas as well. It's very important to mention, to participate in the construction of history at the most structural level. So these are images from our installation that's actually being built now in the Arsenale at the Venice Biennale in Venice, called An Archaeology of Disability, in which we reconstruct things from the Acropolis that have never been reconstructed before with disabled people through languages of disability, ASL, vibrotactility, new kinds of aesthetics of rustication that draw on contour representations and other things to revive histories of trauma, violence, actually histories of race at the site, as that term might be considered in ancient times, among myriad other concepts. I hope you all get a chance to see it. So just to wrap this up, we see a form of preservation that emerges because of someone's impairments, not despite them, okay? And here we also overturn the logic of accessible heritage and imagine how culture originates or could originate with impairment itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that fascinating talk. I'm going to turn things over to Dale now. Dale Kretz, in history at Texas Tech. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you, David. Thank you to Julie as well for organizing the symposium. Can everybody see my slide okay? Okay, great. Well, today I am going to offer just a few remarks about the African-American experience with the healthcare system in the United States. And I'm going to pay special attention to the spaces in which they encountered professional medical care. And my hope is that this brief survey will offer a useful perspective on the history, legacies, and the enduring challenges of healthcare and health provisioning in America. Now, the medical care of enslaved people featured prominently in debates over slavery. In the face of hundreds of testimonials by formerly enslaved men and women charging widespread neglect or abuse, pro-slavery propagandists argued that Southern bondspeople were, in fact, well treated in times of sickness. In fact, far better than Northern factory workers. Now, in making their case, the defenders of slavery pointed to the ideal of the well-designed and fully appointed plantation hospital as proof of the benevolent slaveholders' commitment to maintaining the health of their enslaved workers. But of course, enslaved people were not only laborers, but also capital. And slaveholders certainly had a vested interest in preserving the working health of their commodified workers. American slavery was, after all, a private property regime, and preserving the laboring health of the enslaved was vital to its fundamental project of exploiting their labor. And so it's important, therefore, to look beyond any given slaveholder's self-congratulatory pretensions to understand how orthodox medicine and healthcare provisioning functioned as mechanisms of control over the lives of the enslaved. So what did health provisioning look like in the slave South? Well, on smaller estates, slaveholders might call on a nearby physician in times of sickness, or alternatively, they might delegate the therapeutic role to an overseer, or even more commonly to an enslaved healer or nurse. On larger estates, slaveholders frequently employed professional physicians who specialized in treating the enslaved. Some plantations also featured on-site infirmaries or hospitals, such as this one here, the Yucca Slave Hospital on the Melrose Plantation in Louisiana. Now, while they did exist on certain estates, well-built and fully appointed hospitals rarely typified healthcare facilities in the plantation South. Moreover, buildings described as slave hospitals in plantation journals might be little more than a slave cabin used to isolate those afflicted with fevers, or simply a place to confine the putatively sick to keep them from running away. And finally, even when slave hospitals did exist on large plantations, they were often unhygienic and poorly managed, even by early 19th century standards. But the plantation was not the only site of orthodox medical attention to the enslaved. Across the antebellum South, that's the pre-Civil War South, there existed a number of slave infirmaries located in major towns and cities. Now, many of these slave infirmaries were even attached to Southern medical schools. In fact, this was an era of intense competition between medical schools for students. Southern medical schools boasted few advantages over their more industrialized and well-established Northern counterparts. But they did have one conspicuous advantage. In their recruiting efforts, medical schools from Baltimore to New Orleans vigorously advertised the abundance of enslaved subjects upon which the medical students could learn their trade. In fact, in the 3 decades before the Civil War, well over 40 Southern medical institutions advertised their facilities as specifically available for the treatment of Black patients and/or enslaved subjects. Now, Southern physicians and their various medical institutions were thus not only deeply involved in slavery, but invested in it as well. By the 1840s and 1850s, urban-based slave infirmaries sprouted up in places with high concentrations of enslaved men and women. Not incidentally, these were also the same places that featured prominent slave markets, where those same men and women could be bought and sold. In fact, the cartographic imprint of slave hospitals mapped perfectly onto the landscape of slavery. and specifically the major nodes of slave trading, from Charleston to New Orleans. Now let's take the hospital known as Turo Infirmary as a case study. Now, built alongside the New Orleans waterfront, Turo Infirmary was originally a plantation house known as the Paulding Mansion before its conversion into a hospital. It opened its doors and its 28 beds in 1855. Now, during its first 5 years, Turo admitted 1,600 patients, half of whom were enslaved. A significant number of these enslaved patients were actually brought to the hospital by slave traders, operating just a few blocks away in the largest slave market in North America. And here I'll zoom in on the picture just a little bit. You'll note two things. First, the blurb on the top, boasting of its convenient location to the waterfront slave markets. You'll note the prohibition of patients with contagious afflictions, and finally, the $1 charge for slaves. Now, the hospital fees for these 800 enslaved patients that I mentioned were paid by the traders themselves, who were looking to make enormous profits by selling plausibly healthy slaves in the nearby market. And so slave trading then generated significant revenue for the young Turo Infirmary. And although it's a bit difficult to tell from this image, and I think this is the best image we have, Turo comprised 2 residential buildings. The smaller building was converted into an infirmary consisting of a number of small rooms connected via a central corridor. And this building on the left was probably the site of the slave ward. The larger main residence would most likely have housed white patients and the resident infirmary physician, who would later go on and serve as a surgeon in the Confederate Army. No surprise. And so, as with other commercial hospitals in New Orleans and elsewhere in the slave South, Turo Infirmary operated segregated units for enslaved and Black patients. Now, it's important to remember that until the late 19th century or so, when most Americans got sick, they would not have gone to a hospital. They would have opted instead for a treatment in their own homes. Hospitals were not only rather sparse outside of large urban areas, and America was predominantly rural in the 19th century, but access to hospital care was limited mainly to poor patients who couldn't afford a home visit. Now, the fact that there was so little inpatient provisioning at this time again underscores how important slavery was to institutionalized medicine in the South, providing, as it did, so many unwilling subjects upon which Southern doctors could practice their trade. It underscores as well how important professional medicine was to the institution of slavery. Both were partners in the production of medical knowledge and the maintenance of the slave economy. And it should be said, both required and relied upon the control of enslaved men and women in a variety of spaces, therapeutic or otherwise. Now, before the Civil War, public officials in the North and the South shouldered virtually no responsibility for free African Americans in times of sickness. Exclusion was the order of the day. After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the federal government tried mightily to compel local authorities to assume care. Now, after decades of struggle, what finally emerged by the end of the 1880s was a shift from a general policy of exclusion to one of segregation. And segregation at this time was quickly being written into national, state, and local law. And the timing here is important. Hospital segregation developed in the same period that saw, first, the birth of modern medicine, and second, the social transformation of the hospital from a primarily charitable institution to the primary facility for delivering medical care to the general public. Now, under the familiar separate but equal framework, African Americans were promised facilities equivalent to those of whites, but in reality were afforded much, much less. Now, for a time, many African Americans and their white allies actively sought to build separate institutions, with the belief, however naive in hindsight, that such facilities could in fact be made equal. One such promoter was Booker T. Washington, who in 1910 noted the dramatic growth of Black hospitals throughout the South. In 1894, according to Washington, there was only one Black physician in Alabama. By 1910, there were more than 100. and they ran 6 hospitals in the state, including the John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital in Tuskegee, shown here. Now, whether inspired by the Washingtonians or pressed by few choices and fewer resources, Black health activists built a steady stream of Black-run medical organizations, hospitals, and training programs in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, amounting to what scholars have since called a Black medical world. For example, the first hospital in Durham, North Carolina, Watts Hospital, was built in 1895 to provide care for the white citizens of Durham. And this is a picture of Watts Hospital. But Durham also had a sizable and relatively affluent Black population, such that in the year 1900, the administrators of Watts proposed adding a wing to the hospital specifically to treat Black patients. But the Black community in Durham objected to the plan, knowing that Black doctors, residents, and nurses would have been precluded from practicing in a white establishment. It would only admit Black patients. And so the Black community in Durham proposed instead to construct an entirely separate hospital where African Americans could not only be admitted as patients, but also, importantly, serve as medical providers. And so the result was the construction of the Lincoln Hospital in 1901, seen here. Now, Lincoln Hospital grew and prospered as a Black-run institution, such that by 1925, it moved to a newer, larger building, this building here, also in Durham. Now, yet, even successful Black medical establishments such as Lincoln Hospital faced increased pressure on several fronts. First, they had to contend with increased demand from Black patients, whose healthcare needs bore all of the negative health consequences of Jim Crow. Second, in trying to respond adequately to those needs and to keep up with rapidly evolving clinical and operational standards, Black medical establishments operated from severely diminished funds. Now, Black patients were primarily cared for in all Black hospitals, but the number of all Black hospitals nationwide had actually decreased from just over 200 in 1923 to only 124 by 1944. Fewer than 80 Black hospitals were available to the 9.7 million Black Southerners in 1944, and most of them were unaccredited and under-equipped and struggling to remain open. And so for these and other reasons, a significant number of African Americans would therefore have encountered a segregated facility. Now, the architecture of racist segregation in white-dominated establishments represented a design-based effort to manage and compartmentalize the amount of contact Black patients would be able to make with whites in these facilities. And this compartmentalization was imposed architecturally in 2 major ways, through isolation and partitioning. Now, isolation involved entirely separate buildings for Black and white patients, as in this image here. This is a blueprint of St. Luke's Hospital in Jacksonville. A few things to note. First, note the fewer number of facilities available for patients of color. Second, their placement across a creek, cut off from the main thoroughfares and paths linking the other white buildings. Note as well their proximity to the street and the power plant. And finally, the distinct lack of specialization. Partitioning, however, was probably more common than isolation, and it involved more sophisticated architectural techniques of managing interracial contact by internally subdividing shared spaces, such as in this blueprint of Macon City Hospital in Georgia. Now, many white hospitals devoted particular sections to Black patients, sometimes entire wards or floors, but other times only a few rooms. And so these carefully circumscribed Black spaces in Jim Crow hospitals were predictably located in the least desirable areas of the hospital facility. Sometimes, as in this photo, they also had their own entrances in order to further reduce interracial contact. Now, in recognition of America's national health crisis, Congress passed and Truman signed into law the Hospital Survey and Construction Act in 1946, better known as the Hill Burton Act. And for 25 years, the Hill Burton program practically rebuilt the nation's hospital system. Between 1947 and 1974, the Hill Burton program dispersed $3.7 billion to the states, contributing 30% of the funds for all hospital projects and an additional $9 billion in matching local and state funds. And so federal funds from the Hill Burton program supported the creation of over 9,000 new medical facilities. And the South received an outsized proportion of these funds. And it should be said, Black people's access to hospital care improved across the board. However, there's also a catch to this pragmatic good. The Hill Burton Act contained a separate but equal provision, which held that discrimination on the basis of race in these hospitals was acceptable if the healthcare provisioning was in fact equitable. And it's noteworthy that this is the only explicitly segregationist provision to appear in federal legislation in the 20th century United States. And it's very telling that it applied to hospitals. Now, Alabama, for example, used Hill Burton funds to construct racially segregated or separate facilities in all but 2 of its 67 counties. Other southern states engaged in similar practices. And so each year, as hospital construction and renovation swept the nation, Black medical leaders and civil rights groups had become more and more agitated with the expansion of segregated medical facilities under the Hill Burton program. Full integration, what only some Black leaders have been pushing for all along, was now widely regarded as the only way to secure health justice. Now, hospitals presented a powerful barrier to civil rights objectives because they were legally defined as private institutions. Thus, their private status insulated them from legal prohibitions that were applied to public entities, such as schools. Judicial battles led by the NAACP dealt a major challenge to Dr. Jim Crow. It came in the form of a case from North Carolina, which at the time had only 9 hospitals for African Americans, including Lincoln Hospital in Durham. In 1962, a group of Black doctors and patients filed a federal suit against 2 Hill Burton-funded white hospitals for prohibiting Black patients. And the litigation strategy against these hospitals was to challenge the definition of private that granted them immunity from federal oversight. In the 1963 case of Simpkins v. Cone, the Supreme Court finally invalidated the separate but equal provision that was the bedrock of Jim Crow. It was essentially the Brown v. Board of Education for the American hospital system, though it didn't arrive until nearly a decade after Brown. Now, the Simpkins decision signaled an end to the hospital apartheid regime in the United States, but it would take another piece of legislation to deal the final blow. On July 30th, 1965, LBJ signed into law Medicare, the federally funded system of hospital insurance for Americans aged 65 or older. Now, after Medicare became law, more than 7,000 hospitals were forced to comply in order to receive the much desired federal funding for Medicare patients. And the establishment of Medicare dramatically raised the cost to hospitals that were still resisting integration. And so long-term defiance of the law was simply not an option. Now, many scholars have rightly observed that few other efforts to eliminate racial segregation in the United States moved as smoothly or as swiftly as Medicare. Now, today, hospitals are no longer segregated, but our cities remain so. And the history of segregation continues to pose serious health consequences. In St. Louis, for example, residents separated by only a few blocks have up to an 18-year difference in life expectancy. Now, because of ongoing racial segregation in the neighborhoods of St. Louis and virtually every other metropolitan center in the United States, many areas with high Black populations are also areas with concentrated poverty and poor health. And these neighborhoods often lack resources like adequate housing, food, income, education, safety, and convenient access to medical care. And even when it's accessible, medical care is simply unaffordable for the vast majority of Americans, particularly the poor and the non-white. And despite the critical interventions of Medicare and Medicaid, the hospital system in the United States, from insurance to treatment to pharmaceuticals, is still a private for-profit business. And so, of all the lessons taught by the history of African Americans and the healthcare system, I would argue that the biggest one we must reckon with is the absolute necessity of disentangling healthcare and health provisioning from the profit motive, from any and all forms of commodification that alienate us from our own bodily autonomy and anchor us to larger systems of exploitation. Thank you.
Good luck putting those two talks together.
Well, thank you both for two excellent talks. I really enjoyed both, and I do have a couple questions. So the way that Julie and I discussed this initially was that I would just kind of ask one general question to kind of get things going, but avoid monopolizing the conversation too much. So I want to turn it over to the audience after that and take questions from everyone. So as I was listening, first, I'll start with David, since he came first. I was thinking about how to put these historical and architectural perspectives into conversation, since that's one of the themes that we're dealing with here. And with David, the point about developing a critical perspective from an impaired standpoint, and the sort of the concrete examples that you give to show how it could be applied to the design of historical monuments is a really important point. It's one that I myself have been dealing with in my own recent work on deaf subjects in early modern history. So a slightly different context, a slightly different sort of set of historical monuments or documents. But so that was really fascinating to me, and I appreciated that. But Dale's talk, on the other hand, brought forward some important points about how thinking with and about race in hospitals brings to the fore some rather concrete effects in the spatial design of those buildings that might otherwise go overlooked. So David, kind of taking that insight, I wondered if you might have any thoughts about how you might apply this to spaces, your insight about applying the impaired standpoint to healthcare spaces. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you weren't going to specifically be dealing with that here, but I wondered if you see any applicability to what you've done here in spaces devoted more specifically to healthcare. And then conversely for Dale, since I have a little bit more familiarity with some of your other work, I wondered if you might want to expand a little bit on what kinds of connections you see between race and disability in history, which often are treated as two separate, distinct categories of analysis, but two that I think one could make an argument have some potential for overlap. So I wondered if maybe you wanted to offer some kind of general comments about that, and how we should think and talk about kind of the interconnections, intersections between those moving forward.
Should I go first?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I guess I have a provocation that I would throw out there into the Zoom world, and relative to your question, which I think historically, one of the things that disabled people have tried to liberate themselves from is the concept of health, and being seen through the lens of health. So your question is a very difficult one to answer. I'm sure many people on this panel know the various models that people that work more explicitly in disability studies, which is not necessarily my approach, deal with. So one of the key examples, as you know, Jacob, is comparing the medical model to a social or critical model of human impairment, right? So I would say that so historically the movement for disability rights in the United States involves freeing freeing the history of disabled people from the very histories that are embedded in places like hospitals and institutions, and discovering forms of communalism, or which is a more recent thing, and earlier the kind of drive for autonomy, and we can question that as well. Independence from medicine. So that's a very difficult question to answer. I think a true disability history of health would be one that tries to push back or critically reconsider the whole structure of health in this country. Yeah. In particular, and then more generally. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say in my field that disability has only recently become, established as a category of analysis, sort of on par with race, class, and gender. And the best word on this subject between race and disability, I think, is still belongs to Douglas Bainton, who wrote a really influential article called "Disability and the Justification of Inequality in American History," where he basically argues that disability and the language of disability and impairment has always served as a way to basically justify the exclusion of certain individuals from the body politic. And the catch here that he identifies is that for a lot of groups, African Americans, women, immigrants, their struggles for equality and inclusion have to begin with a sort of pushback against this prevalent notion that they're in fact disabled, that African Americans are inherently disabled, that there's some, disabling, essence to their bodies. And so by rejecting that they are disabled en masse as a group, they're essentially, implying that disability is a legitimate category of exclusion. It just doesn't apply to us. It might be better applied to other groups, but not us. And so that's really the sort of, ironic catch to disability and the struggle for equality in the United States. And it's a very intimate history with the history of race. And a number of scholars are doing really good work on the interconnections between, disabled individuals and race in the United States, be it African Americans or immigrants. Douglas Bainton's latest book is on the exclusion of immigrants in the late 19th, early 20th century by the Bureau of Immigration, basically seeing disability, individual disability, as a sort of shorthand for race. Race is a very nebulous category, but a disabled individual, well, that signals a certain kind of heredity that you could probably, extrapolate on a larger scale. And so there's separate categories of analysis in some ways, but also race and disability functioned so intimately throughout American history, and still do.
Can I add something to that? I think one of the, in this book project that I'm wrapping up, I think one of the reasons that I'm looking for a politics outside of access is that I think historically in the United States, access has been a way to distinguish a quote unquote disability rights, which are coded as white, from the civil rights that were trying to be achieved by Black Americans decades earlier. For example, a lot of the access, a lot of the calls around accessibility involve many of the same spaces that were centers of Black civil rights in the US. Buses, transportation, sidewalks, educational spaces, hospitals. So it's a very, the history of disability is often in the United States is often coded as very much as white. And I think one of the reasons is this issue of access, which appeals to a sense of individualism and autonomy, which is also very much coded as white in this country. So for me, moving past access is I find very effective for my own growth as a thinker, to dislodge a kind of whiteness and to from disability rights, and to think about other kinds of connections and intersections that we can create as impaired people with others. So yeah.
Thank you both for that. We have a couple questions. So there's one that's been typed into the Q&A. I'll read it out loud, and then we've got some others in the chat as well. This is from Jean. I'm curious about how the initial means of architectural segregation, i.e. isolation versus partitioning, would have influenced the practice of desegregation. Clearly, with segregation literally built into the hospitals, desegregation might involve not only allowing African Americans into the hospital, but breaking down the spatial barriers. And I suppose that's mainly for Dale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I would say that in part it's about repurposing the space after desegregation. So what do you do with the colored waiting room? I was trying to find more information about this, but it's on such an individual, case by case basis, what they made with the space, whether it be internally divided or separate buildings altogether. Another way that segregation operated in hospitals was by time. So some hospitals would have Black patients on certain days of the week, white patients on every other day of the week. And so how hospitals on an individual level adjusted spatially to desegregation, I think it's a very important topic. I can't say too much in the general respect now, but it did happen rather swiftly. As important as the Simpkins v. Cone decision was, a lot of hospitals were still able to resist until Medicare. Then they quickly had to adjust very, very quickly, more quickly than most hospitals actually wanted to. And so how they actually manage that spatially, I think, is a very interesting question.
And then we have a question from Dora Epstein-Jones. I'm getting a message that her talking is permitted for Dora, so she can chime in.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I want to thank David and Dale, and I suppose that this is just kind of a general question for whomever wants to address it. But I'm wondering about the role of segregation and discrimination, and that their relationship to the aesthetics and maybe even the theatrics of hygiene. So the use of high quality glass, white tiling versus the kind of institutional green paint that seems to pervade in the segregated hospitals and in the healthcare facilities that are usually targeted for a lower income. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also wish I could have gone into more detail about that. So the sort of spatial experience one would have walking into a white hospital, which would have been white in an aesthetic sense. It would have been clinical, shiny, very, very different than a lot of African American run hospitals. I think I showed the one picture of the first Lincoln Hospital, which was essentially a house. It was a home. Oftentimes that's what Black run establishments had to make do with. Sometimes Black hospitals were actually instituted in formerly white hospitals that were abandoned. So they really had to make do with very limited resources, a very strapped ability to actually keep up with clinical and diagnostic and technological standards, which is why so many Black hospitals were unaccredited, and all at the same time having to respond to, the just massive gargantuan health consequences of Jim Crow. And that's something that we're still dealing with, right? So people born when segregation was legal in virtually every southern state would be, in their mid to late 60s now. And they would be passing, defects onto their they'll be passing negative health consequences onto their children. And living in segregated areas is stressful. And so more historians and scholars and doctors are showing the ongoing health consequences of having a Jim Crow zip code as a birthplace. But back to your point, I mean, the sort of divide between a white clinical therapeutic space and a Black space, which would be more domestic or deprived in one material respect or another. I mean, that's another important component to this story. And again, I think it has to be unpacked on a sort of case by case basis, but still very important to individual experiences with the hospital system in the United States.
Hi, this is Dora again. David, I'm wondering if you have a perspective on these kinds of aesthetics from the questions of disability discrimination and disability perception.
I hate to give this as an answer, but I have to think about this more. I don't I don't have a response to that question, I'm afraid. It is a really interesting question around the aesthetics of hygiene, but it's not really something that I've really thought about in any depth. So I apologize.
Well, no, it's fine. I just will say, as the mother of a disabled child, that there's a lot of hygiene theater that surrounds, and that hygiene theater seems to diminish the older he gets and becomes now starting to become a disabled adult. And so the pediatric hygiene theater is much more amplified than the one that we would receive now that he's in his teens. And I find that interesting, and I think that hygiene tends to also act as a kind of value added device within the architecture, within the architectural spectrums. And so we see in upper class white neighborhoods, private hospitals, being sheathed in all of this glass, and as opposed to the occupation of former institutions. It was a school, now it's a clinic or something like that. It was a bank, and now it's a clinic in the lower income neighborhoods as well. So I mean, it's that kind of theatrics as well that I'm very, very interested in.
I mean, I think I can give a perspective on it in this way. One of the questions among people that work in art and architecture history often is like, how did like a kind of optical aesthetics, or the primacy of the optical rise as like the concept through which aesthetics is transmitted to or arises in the mind of a beholder, right? And some of the more interesting theories that are emerging now is that it's entangled with histories of health and sanitation. So for example, the engagement with religious objects was primarily through touch, right? Up until actually the early 19th century. And so as emerging ideas about health intersected with concepts about aesthetics, primarily in a European context, we see the emergence of the kind of optical as becoming primary, because it doesn't involve the ickiness of physical engagement with artifacts. That was a very significant way through which people had aesthetic experience. So in that way, I'd say it's extends far outside healthcare, of course. So it's a generality, right? And not again that this is the worst or the ultimate outcome of all that, but it does create it does give rise to people like Georgina, who have to demand a place for her own aesthetic experiences back into the ideas of aesthetics themselves, because they're discounted at a fundamental level and based upon concepts of health. So yeah.
Thank you both for engaging these questions.
Yeah, I have to say, Dale, that was really impressed with the way that you could encapsulate so much history in 25 minutes. It was really, really impressive.
Yeah, it never feels that way, because you're not doing justice to the things you want to actually spend some time on. But a quick and dirty overview. Yeah, thank you. I appreciated your talk as well. And one major thing I took away from it was this idea that disability is nothing new, right? So people in the past also had experiences with disablement, and they would have had certain experiences with, the Acropolis when it wasn't, in ruins, right? When it was actually, a functioning, building. And so I think part of what you're suggesting is that we need to appreciate the historical experiences of disablement in order to, approach these, same spaces today.
Okay, thank you.
Is that right, or is that a? Yeah.
No, that's fine. I think the subtext of it all is like, why are there so few disabled architects, archaeologists, and historians? Which is deeply embedded with the very material idea of what history is. But yeah, I appreciate what you said. Thank you. Yeah.